the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I am Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And today I'm joined by my co-host Pete Brown of Microsoft in Maryland in the United States. How you going, Pete?
Good. Absolutely crazy week, Vin. This is our big developer event week, so good to kick it off this way.
Awesome. Yeah, look, it's been, I'm quiet in some areas and crazy in others. So that's just, the usual part of the course in the music tech zoo for me. Now, today we have a very special guest, and that is Dave Smith, who's the founder of Sequential Circuits and the designer of the legendary Prophet 5, which was the first fully programmable polyphonic synthesizer that utilized a microprocessor that at the time absolutely revolutionized the way synthesizers could be used in both studio and live performance. He was also the driving force behind the MIDI specification, which is still in use 4 decades on, as well as many other innovative instruments and music technologies. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You're most welcome, Dave. I seriously doubt there is anyone listening in that has not directly benefited in some way with the innovations that you developed. Personally, look, they were pivotal points for me, both in usability in the studio and live performance, as I already mentioned with the innovations you brought in with the Prophet 5, as well as sparking my creativity by allowing me to be able to utilize the technology when I started exploring sequencing for the first time. Allowed me to drive the synths and the drum machines, and allowed me to create my song arrangements away from my band environment. And then I could present the songs to the band, and then we'd work on them together and finish them off as a band environment. So that was invaluable to me. So even just on those 2 small points, I personally owe you a huge debt of gratitude.
Okay.
And for that, thank you very much, Dave. Now, to get this rolling, it would be great if you can share your personal history with music and technology and how that led to your eventual journey to founding the company.
Oh, well, let's see. How far back should we go? I was born in 1950. Maybe not that far back.
Okay.
So, we always had a piano in the house. My mother was a piano player. So I played around with that. I probably took lessons, but as everybody else does, you stop doing that fairly quickly. But it was always fun to bang around on it. And like everybody else in the early mid-'60s, I switched to guitar when the Beatles and the British invasion started.
Of course.
And in high school, I don't think I ever actually played in a band, but I'd get together with people in the neighborhood and we'd play around. And in college, I actually did play in a couple bands that didn't go anywhere, but it was certainly fun. I was playing actually bass in those bands.
Right.
And I was, at the same time, I was going to school, and I ended up, first I went to school just to stay out of the draft so I didn't have to go to the Army.
Oh, okay.
This was in the late 60s when Vietnam was going on.
Yes.
And if you went to school, you didn't go to the Army.
Right.
Which was totally unfair, but I took advantage of it.
Yep.
And then halfway through college, they got rid of that, and so it wasn't a problem after that. But I was taking electrical engineering and computer science, and ended up with a degree from University of California at Berkeley in 1971. And, I had been playing in bands. So I had this technology background and I had this music background, and I sort of combined them.
Right.
Which, the event that started all of that was when a friend told me, hey, there's this little store nearby that has a synthesizer in it. And, I've heard of synthesizers, but didn't really know much about them. So I went to go look. and they had a Mini Moog. This was in, I think, 1972. So they were brand new.
Yep.
And I had no idea what it did. All I saw is that it had a keyboard on it and it had a bunch of knobs, and I just knew I had to have it.
Yep. Awesome.
So I went to my company credit union, got a loan for $1,500 somehow, and went back the next day and bought it.
Yeah. Now, $1,500 back in those days would have bought you a car, wouldn't they?
Just about. Yeah, definitely.
Amazing. Yep.
So, and yeah, that's what got me started. It was I think it's serial number 1340, and they started it at 1,000. So it's, one of the first 300 made. I still have it. It's in the company offices in San Francisco.
Is it working?
Yeah. On a good day. Sometimes it turns left when you don't expect it, but it's generally working. It's had a lot of work on it over the years, of course, and it's even disappeared for years at a time. Somebody'd borrow it and I'd forget about it, or it's actually pretty amazing that it's still around and still working. It's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
How soon until you actually dismantled it and tried to learn something from inside it?
Almost immediately. Back then, for some strange reason, they shipped the unit with the schematics. And so the first thing I started to do is adding, an extra control voltage to do this or that. And I didn't know what I was doing, even with my engineering degree. It was... I was more into the computer side of things, and it's a whole different world, what you learn in college from real world playing around with electronics, as you probably know. But yeah, I almost immediately started doing that. I started making little accessories for it. And the first big thing I did was to build a analog sequencer. Moog had these huge ones that were very expensive. And, back then being naive, I'd write a letter to them expecting somebody to send back asking, hey, can I see an operation manual for this? I'm interested in it. And of course, there was no operation manual ever. And, there's probably, nobody to even answer the letters. So I decided to build my own. So I did that in 1973 and then 74. It was 3 rows of 16 knobs, and and so I built it for my own use. I bought a Tascam 3340 around then. That was, if you look in the history books, that was the first multi-channel home tape recorder that you could buy. It was 4 channels, and you can record and overdub with it. And before that, you couldn't do that. So I was playing around with that, and after I built the sequencer, I said, oh, well, if I like this, maybe other people would. So in 1974, I started a company called Sequential Circuits, and my first product was the sequencer. And I sold a whopping 4 of them.
Wow.
Yeah, because, I had a full-time day job. I was working by this time in microprocessors in Silicon Valley. That was my day job.
Right.
So, this was just something to do nights and weekends just for fun.
Yep.
Nice.
Now, actually, of those early pre-Prophet 5 instruments that you created, well, they weren't instruments, they were, musical devices. There was 2 sequences, but the one that got my interest, and it's one that I was completely unaware of, was the Model 700 programmer, which hooked into... Now, correct me if I'm wrong, the Mini Moog and the ARP, and allowed you to save the patches. Am I right there?
That's correct. After the analog sequencer, the next product was a digital sequencer, the Model 800, and actually sold a few hundreds of those over the years. And then I did the Model 700 programmer. And it was basically a device that allowed programmability on a Mini Moog and an ARP 2600. Not complete programmability, but enough that you could actually, change patches fairly quickly on it. It could set the oscillator pitch, it could set the filter pitch, it had 2 envelopes, and it had backup memory, so you could save it all.
How did you interface with the circuitry on the Mini Moog and the ARP for this?
Just by control voltages and triggers.
Oh, okay. So you use the existing interfaces, or did you crack it open and okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think on the Mini Moog you had to add one connector. I forget which one it was, but I think most of it was available just with all the connectors that were already there.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Wow. Yes, that was my initial question. I was chatting to Pete pre-show, saying that product was one that I wasn't aware of, and we were discussing what was the connectivity. I just couldn't wrap my head around it, Dave. So thank you very much for explaining that one. Now that was, what was that? That was 1976. So let's fast forward to the Prophet 5, because that definitely changed the game. I mean, because when that was released, that shifted the whole paradigm where people, the rest of the guys had to respond. So can you give us some insight on the development of that Prophet 5?
Sure. So, as of 1977, I still had a full-time day job. I had the idea for something like a Prophet 5 for a while, at least a few months, and I just assumed that everybody else would do it because it was such an obvious idea.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best ideas are obvious, but not to everybody. But basically, the thought was I knew that Solid State Music, which was a Silicon Valley company that, so nearby, was coming out with a set of chips that would be they had a VCO chip, a filter chip, envelope chips, and VCA chips. Mm-hmm. So I knew that, it'd be fairly easy, to take a set of those and control it with a microprocessor, which to me was the easy part, because that's what I've been doing, and make a fully programmable polyphonic synth.
Right.
But it wasn't until I think spring of 77, I finally decided, maybe nobody else is doing it. And I quit my day job and pretty much just dived into the design of what became the Prophet 5. So, but again, it was, to me, just polyphony, programmability, microprocessor. I guess those are the key points that allowed the Prophet 5 to be what it was.
Yep. And the two key companies back then, look, off the top of my head, would probably be Moog and ARP.
Yep.
Oberheim. Tom had he had his SEM modules out.
Yep.
And there was that 4-voice, but that was basically wasn't that just four modules together, and each one had its own individual control. So it wasn't like a polyphonic synth that had like a universal control interface where, each module was still an individual module that you'd had to program into separately. Am I correct there?
Well, yeah, there was a 4-voice version and an 8-voice version. Yeah. And it did, at some point he added basic programmability. So you could save, a large part of what was going on, but not the whole thing.
Right.
Plus, like you said, every module was separate. So if you knocked a knob on one of them, then, every fourth note would be out of tune, or it was as good as people could have at the time, but it just wasn't, it wasn't everything in one package ready to go like the Prophet 5.
Right. Yeah.
So you had to invent. I'm going to use the word invent here. Maybe that's not 100% correct, but you had to invent a mechanism by which you could scan all the pots and the controls and stuff like that, because nobody else was doing that at the time, right?
Well, yeah, invent, I think, is too strong of a word. It's pretty easy to multiplex a bunch of pots and digitize them, which is all I was doing. And I'm sure somebody else had been doing it by then. I'm not sure how the programmer worked on the 4 voices. But, the technology for that is pretty trivial. It's really simple. And it's actually really simple on the other side, because basically you just digitize the pots and the switches. And on the other side, you have a D to A converter to make control voltages to control the analog voice. So conceptually, it's really but simple. I mean, a bunch of stuff goes into the microprocessor, a bunch of stuff comes out, and then you save the numbers in between to memory when you want to. And that's really the whole thing.
Spoken like a true engineer. It's very simple to you. But yeah, nobody else was doing keyboard scanning or a lot of the other stuff that you kind of put out there, or at least they weren't putting the package together. So that was pretty amazing.
Well, actually, as it turned out, this is one of those things that being in Silicon Valley helped. I had met the guys from EMU System, like Dave Rossum, and they actually were doing a scanning digital keyboard for their big modular things, and they actually got into some patent issues with Alan Oregon, who also had a scanning patent of some sort.
Right.
And so the scanning part, it's just here I am going again. It's just a diode matrix of switch on-off switches. So it's amazing that anybody could patent that at all, because that's what any panel that has a bunch of switches is. So the fact that it's a keyboard doesn't really matter. But so EMU was doing it. Alan Oregon was doing it on organs because they were pretty early into the digital organs. So it wasn't something that I came up with.
Right. But look, and still surprising to me to this day that those larger companies, like you said, you were waiting for these guys to actually come up with a polyphonic synthesizer and a programmable synthesizer. And I don't think ARP ever produced a polyphonic synth, did they? Or am I missing the boat here?
Eventually they did the Chroma.
Oh, yes.
And Moog had early on done the Poly Moog, which was not really the same thing.
No, it wasn't programmable with a Poly Moog.
Not really.
No, and the memory Moog came much later, and
that was much later. But what ARP did is they decided to put all their marbles into the guitar synthesizer market.
Right.
And they even told me that after the fact. Oh, well, yeah, we had the idea, but we decided to do this instead. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea. But that, of course, was a major mistake. They did the, basic marketing sales mistake of saying, oh, well, the guitar market is so much bigger. If we get 1% of that market, we're going to make a killing here. But of course, getting 1% of the market wasn't going to happen. So, and they never recovered from that, I don't think.
Yeah.
I can't even remember the ARP guitar synth.
Yeah, the ARP Axe.
Oh, yes, I can. Sorry.
But it had really high latency or something, which is what killed it, if I remember correctly.
It's just hard to play. You had to be very careful of how you played it, so you didn't get false triggers. And and people have been working on guitar synthesizers in 40 years since, and they've gotten somewhat better. But to my taste, it's just a stupid controller for a synthesizer. It really is. Play a guitar or play a synthesizer, but every time I tried to play them, and people give demos, and they're doing Hammond organ riffs on a guitar, which is about the most lame thing you could possibly think of. And it's so I just think it's something that wasn't meant to be personally, but that's my bias.
Yeah.
Hard to disagree with that.
Yeah. And so, look, and just cycling back to the Prophet 5, when that was released, that would have been an enormous shift for your company, because to say that it was a hit would be an understatement, Dave.
It was a huge problem. We were a tiny company. We had way too many orders. We had like a 2-year backlog.
Really? 2 years?
Well, I forget. I'm making that up partially, but I know we didn't really catch up for orders. Maybe it was 2 years until we actually caught up, maybe longer.
Wow.
We had problems with, the reliability of the unit was not very good. I was in my 20s. I didn't know what I was doing, and building something this monstrous of a project, pretty much mostly by myself. I mean, I did the mechanical design, I did the schematics, I did the board layouts, I did the software. I pretty much did the whole thing. So, wow. And, the first units didn't work all that well. Everybody had a love-hate relation with them because they, loved the way it sounded, but they hated the reliability aspect. And on top of that, and somewhat related, some of the parts we were getting were not very reliable. I remember having envelope chips that we would get, and you'd turn them on, and you'd have a nice 30-second release. And if you wait 10 minutes and the unit warms up, you'd have a 3-second release instead of a 30-second release, which doesn't work too well in production or on the stage. So we were trying to grow. We were trying to, we were underfunded. We were not funded. That was the problem. This was all bootstrapped. So everything was going against us except the fact that we had a product that everybody wanted.
Yep.
So somehow we got through the first couple of years until I was finally able to redesign the part pretty much completely, which became the Rev 3 version.
Yes.
And we switched it, as you know, the Curtis parts at that point, and they became much more reliable. And then, we went on to build another 5,000 or 6,000 after that.
Yep.
Once we got that ironed out.
What was, it doesn't have to be exact, but what was the total number of the first Rev 1 and 2? Because there's not many of them in Australia, but I do remember them being, less than reliable.
Roughly there were 200 Rev 1s and maybe about 1,000 Rev 2s. And the Rev 2s were just kind of a quick redesign to fix the really bad things, but it was still solid-state music parts.
Yep.
And then the Rev 3 was probably 5,000 or so. I think there were 6,000 or 7,000 total. Yeah,
that would be the majority of the units in Australia, that made their way here, I would say. The Rev 3s, yeah. That's awesome. So after the Prophet 5, and I've only ever seen one of these beasts in real life, and I didn't get the opportunity to play it, but I have played Prophet 5s, was the original Prophet 10. And I shudder to think what that weighed, Dave.
It was quite the boat anchor.
That was massive.
Yes, it was.
So that was just essentially 2 Prophet 5s in a huge cabinet, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, and dual manual, which is kind of fun. And it had a pretty powerful polyphonic sequencer that went with it.
All right,
so, it was an interesting product. Back then, people were still dragging Rhodes and Hammonds around. So
yes.
It wasn't that outrageous as it seems like it would be now.
Right.
It would be a minimum 2-man lifter. There's no way you could have. Yeah.
Well, we actually sold them in an anvil case.
Yes.
So that's how they were delivered. So you, at least, I think it had wheels, but maybe not. I probably shouldn't say that. But that was the only way to ship them.
And roadies were just stronger back then, Vin.
Yeah.
And that's how I actually remember it, Dave. It was on display at one of the rehearsal studios that I frequented, and it was in the foyer area, and someone had wheeled it in because they were attempting to sell it, and it was in its anvil road case and with the lid off, so it was still sitting in the bottom of this anvil road. That's my memory recollection of it, but. And it was all taped off. We weren't even allowed to touch it,
Of course not.
Oh, yeah. So that was, and that just burned into my memory, Dave. I only saw it once because the next time I came to the rehearsal, I think it was there for, about a month or so, and then it disappeared. So obviously someone had bought it, but I have no idea whether that is still in the country. We had a period there where a lot of our analog gear was being sold off and shipped overseas, which is a bit of a travesty in my opinion, because the company that was responsible for doing it, I remember them having a conversation with me, years later, having a bit of a bitch about the lack of analog synthesizers still in the country. I've gone, well, mate, you're the one who's selling them and shipping them off.
His fault.
Oh, yeah. Hey, just swinging back. So we're into the 80s now, and you kind of went, not backwards, but you started with a polysynth and went back to a mono, where most, the other companies were starting with a mono and going to a poly. So can you tell us a little bit about the Pro One?
Sure. That kind of summarizes exactly what we were doing. Everybody else was copying us, first with the OBX, and then the Memory Moog, and then the Jupiter 6, and blah, blah, blah.
Jupiter 8, yeah.
Jupiter 8.
Poly 6.
Poly 6.
Yeah, that was nice. I had one of those.
So I just sort of said, why don't we do the exact opposite and make a non-programmable monosynth. So
Right.
that was, and it was roughly the same voice as a Rev 3 Prophet 5.
Yep.
But again, being a monosynth, they just sound different. And then, so it doesn't sound exactly like a Prophet 5. I think it cuts through a lot more, but a lot of that's due to it being monophonic.
Yep.
And yeah, so that was the idea. And we tried to make it as cheap as we could. And we sold a ton of them. And as you know, was used quite a bit and still is used quite a bit by people.
I didn't realize it didn't have, so there's no programmable presets on the unit?
Nope.
That was grab a knob and go for it. Awesome. Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
If it was like that, I assume that you just wired everything directly up to the circuits there. Did as a software person or a microprocessor person, did that just feel weird to you, or did you have somebody else working on it by then?
Actually, there was a microprocessor in there.
Okay.
We had a digital keyboard again, because, we're not going to throw an old-fashioned analog keyboard in there. And we did have a sequencer in there, real simple, non-programmable, but you could record something in and play it back. So we had a really simple, single chip processor. I forget which one it was. But yeah, so it's kind of using some of the new technology, but keeping it mostly old-fashioned, old school.
Nice.
Yeah, awesome. And now we're going to move to one of the most significant paradigm shifts, well, for me, and I think, well, pretty much for the whole industry, and that was MIDI. And I've been reading up, and I actually watched one of your old interviews, and I was just laughing at the original naming. Some of the original names that you guys were coming up with. Can you share that story? Because there was yourself and Taro Kakahashi, who I had the privilege of meeting and having dinner with in the late 90s. Who's my memory of Taro was, just fantastic. So reading up the history and realizing that it was yourself and Taro that were essentially the key drivers for MIDI. That story was great. Can you share that with us, please?
Sure. The short story is, 2 or 3 companies. We were, Roland and Tom Oberheim and I, we'd talk a little bit at trade shows about the need for having a common interface, because by then we all had our own interfaces, because we all realized that naturally, if you have a microprocessor in a product, it'd be real easy to have an interface to have it talk to other products, a simple digital interface. So,
sure.
So we all had one. We, Sequential, we had one that was, 10 times faster than MIDI, and Oberheim had one, and Roland had the DCB bus?
DCB, yeah, DCB. Yeah.
So we had all these idle conversations. So I decided to actually do something about it, and I wrote a paper that I gave in at the AES show in October of, I guess that would have been 81, and presented an interface that I called the Universal Synthesizer Interface, USI, just to have a name on it.
Yep.
And I basically said, here's something that it could be. It doesn't have to be this. I just want to get everybody together to actually do it, because we need to. And as a follow-up, I organized a meeting at the NAMM show in January, and I invited everybody who made keyboards of any kind, and just about everybody came. It was surprising.
Awesome.
So it was same thing. I call this USI. It doesn't have to be this. It could be anything. Who's in, who wants to do this? And it was a little disappointing, because it was pretty clear that a lot of people had no concept of doing a, common product like this. People want, megahertz this, 16 bits that. No, it's got to be this, got to be that. And it quickly became, I got kind of dejected after the meeting, because I said, wow, this doesn't sound like this is going to go anywhere. But what happened is Roland came to me after the meeting and said, well, let's get together and talk about it, because we still want to do it. And so we did meet. And I didn't realize that Roland was actually going down their path of working on something also. because so far the only thing that had been happening is what I was organizing. So once we connected, and then they brought in Korg, Yamaha, and Kawai, who were at least smart enough to get involved, but really didn't understand what we were doing so much. So, all the work was really done with Sequential and Roland. So we worked on it all through 1982, and the story you're referring to was one time Kakahashi came to visit us in San Jose at Sequential, and we were talking about the whole thing, and it came down to the name, and so we had USI, and we had, I forget who said it, but some lawyers were saying, well, you shouldn't use Universal in it because that might cause antitrust problems or something like this, which was hilarious if you think about it.
Yeah.
But, fine. And Roland came up, Kakahashi said, well, we think it should be Universal Musical Instrument Interface as instead. And they thought that was cool because you pronounce it you-me, which you and me. And I tried hard not to roll my eyes. And at the spur of the moment, I came up with, how about musical instrument digital interface? Because I liked the idea that they had of musical instrument and not synthesizer. Why limit it to synthesizers? And if you take out the universal part, then musical instrument digital interface. That's what it is. Has a nice ring to it. Hey. And Kakashi looked at me and said, okay. And that was it. That's how easy it was, because we didn't have to answer to anybody else. So from that day on, it was MIDI.
Yep, and it still is 40 years on. And just quickly, I'm having to think back. The first MIDI instruments. Now, I know that the Prophet 600 was the first sequential one.
I think it was the first MIDI product, period. We shipped it in December of 82.
Right. And then you had to wait for everyone else to catch up.
Well, January of 83 is when we connected a Jupiter 6 and a Prophet 6.
Right.
Yes.
At NAMM. That was, you've seen the pictures. That was the first time two products from different manufacturers actually connected. And I'm pretty sure that Roland was shipping the Jupiter 6 right around then. I know we were definitely shipping first in the United States and I think worldwide, but I think they were a couple months later. So,
I think it was a JX3P, Dave.
I think it was a Jupiter 6. But
was it a Jupiter 6? Okay.
I don't know. I should look up the photos. I have them somewhere, but...
Okay, so Roland's first MIDI instrument was actually the JX3P.
Okay.
And Jupiter 6, maybe around. Look, my first MIDI controlled Roland instrument was the Juno 106, but I did have
that was later. Yeah.
Yeah, but I did have a MIDI retrofit on my Jupiter 8, which was pretty awesome. Yeah.
So we all just agree that it was a Roland instrument beginning with a J. That was the first. So I think we're good.
A Roland instrument with a J and a Prophet 600. So they were the first two, and then it just obviously just snowballed from there, Dave.
It was a slow process because. You could probably find some of the old articles in Keyboard Magazine and stuff. It took a while because there were a lot of naysayers because not invented here. I'm not going to do this. This is stupid. This is too slow. Even the too slow thing was funny because, yes, it was slow on a lot of instruments, but it wasn't because of MIDI. It was because everybody's microprocessor was overtaxed.
Yeah, of course.
And the processors couldn't keep up with MIDI. So, but yeah, there was a bunch of that going on for years. And that's also why I got out of the whole MIDI thing fairly early. Once it became something to, maintain and put out fires. And, when the DX7 came out and for some reason, Yamaha thought velocity only went to 100 and not 127.
I remember that.
And they thought that mono mode was something different than what it was. That was an interesting story, actually. We wanted a mode because we were working on the 6-track at the same time, which was the first multi-timbral polyphonic programmable synth. Yep. And so we wanted to have a way in MIDI to be able to control each of the 6 voices multi-timbrally differently. but we didn't want to tell them why, because
Right.
then we would have had to
Right.
explain what we were doing. So we came up with this mode where it would work, but we didn't really fully explain it, and that's one of the reasons that it was misinterpreted by Yamaha. So we had to add a mode to cover both their version and what we wanted.
Yeah. I do remember that first DX7 with the velocity to 100. I mean, you could slam it as hard as you want. She was not getting to 128.
No.
No. Hey, look, and let's just quickly cover some of those instruments in the 80s. The Prophet T8 was an interesting one for me. I've only physically seen one here in Melbourne, and I was lucky enough to play it. That was a beautiful instrument, Dave, with the weighted action keyboard. And would that be the first velocity sensitive and polyphonic aftertouch synthesizer that hit the market, or did someone else beat you to the punch on that one?
Well, the CS80 had velocity and poly AT, but it wasn't fully programmable.
Right.
The Rhodes/ARP Chroma came out
Yes.
about the same time with a
Yep.
similar keyboard.
Yep.
So I don't know that I would call it the first as such, but it was one of the first.
Yes. Yeah. And then through those 80s, this is a kind of like a pretty volatile time for not only yourself, but a lot of the other synthesizer manufacturers were all going through a tough period through that time, which you could probably give us a little bit of insight into as we move forward. But the instrument, so you had you got into the samplers with the Prophet 2000 and 3000, but the instrument that really sparked my attention was the Prophet VS. So that was 1986. Can you give us some insight into that VS and the vector synthesis development?
Yeah, it was just kind of just a new idea that actually a couple of the guys who worked for me came up with, Josh Jeffy and Chris Meyer.
Mm-hmm.
And they're engineers, and came up with this idea of mixing four oscillators together, digital oscillators, wavetable oscillators.
Yep.
So we just decided to go ahead and try it as something different. And I could talk for hours about how we got to that point, what happened afterwards. There's a lot of things about that project that are kind of interesting, actually. One is that it really shows how fashionable musical instruments can be. You come out with something that has a unique sound, and either people like it or they don't, and either they like it then or later or not at all or all of the above. And for something that different, it wasn't, and we're getting into the digital side of things too, the DX7, the D50, and then the M1 and all of that.
Yep.
Which is what people really wanted. And that's another whole story. People just wanted emulative sounds, and that's the only reason they bought Prophet 5s. It's not because they wanted a synthesizer. But, the VS was a very noisy, aliasy, nasty sounding thing. But when you play the right sounds the right way on it, there's just nothing that sounds like it.
Did it have a lot of, or did it have any similarity to the PPG Wavetone at the time, or is that a different type of approach again with the PPG?
Well, the thing they had in common is they both used digital wavetable oscillators.
Yes.
And that was about it. Actually, I think the PPG had analog filters also, as we did. So yeah, there's some overlap, but the actual concept, the instruments beyond that were pretty different.
Right. Okay.
Because obviously the VS was all about the what we called vector synthesis part of it, and of being able to dynamically mix between two-dimensional space, basically between four oscillators.
Yep.
And then you had the benefit of running it through an analog filter, which always makes things sound better.
Of course.
Yep.
So around that time, it's funny, Dave, you mentioned that everybody wanted emulative sounds because in the late 80s and early 90s, I worked at a music store, and everybody who came in at the time would just wanted to know how good is the piano sound on this particular keyboard. And that was pretty much it. Or the saxophone. Like, I heard so many bad saxophone sounds back then.
Oh, yeah. Ooh.
Hey, I have a quick question for you, Dave.
Sure.
Around the time of the VS, like, how hands-on were you in design at that point? Like, had you just taken over leadership of the company? Were you looking at leading individual projects, or did you still have your kind of hands in the solder?
No, I was still involved, not to the level of doing something, totally by myself. I think the last solo project I had done was the Prophet 600, where we decided we needed something quickly. So I just kind of dived in and did most of it.
Oh, neat.
The VS was done by other people. I was involved. I think we ran into some problems with one of the custom chips we were using, and we had to come up with a quick way of fixing it. But I didn't really write any code for that, or
right.
I don't think I did the board layouts or anything like that. So
it's kind of a transition, yeah.
But yeah, still definitely involved.
Yeah. Hey, just quickly, just one last question on the VS. Did that have any level of wave sequencing, or was that only in the wave station, which we can chat about a little bit later?
Yeah, it didn't do that as such, but you could automate the mix process in that two-dimensional space with an envelope or an LFO. So, if you do an LFO, you can get into rhythmic things, but not, wave sequencing was invented with the wave station.
With the wave station, yeah. Awesome. Now, I've got one question now, and we kind of touched on that the 80s was quite volatile for all of the synthesizer manufacturers. And it was interesting in one of the interviews that I was watching of yours, where you were giving us some insight on the dynamic of competing against the Japanese, because when the market responded to the Prophet 5, the Japanese were obviously at an advantage because they could produce the stuff in larger quantities and for cheaper. So can you give us some insight on that dynamic in competing against that type of market?
It was difficult.
Yeah.
I remember, this might be a good, interesting story. Basically, for some reason, I was over there visiting Kakahashi at their factory, and he was showing me around. And one of the things he showed me was, okay, well, these people work for this small company that build our cables for us. Mm-hmm. And basically, we just tell them what we need, and they go away and figure out how to build them cheaply, and then build them for production and build them cheaply. And I just realized, at home, when we wanted to design something, we'd have to beg reps from the big companies to come in and plead for them to help us, or to even sell to us at, because we're at fairly low quantities compared to a lot of other companies. And over there, everybody cooperates. Everybody works together. And I had to fight to get products built and designed. So not only could they, that's when, built in Japan meant built cheaper, and their quality by then was getting really good. So that wasn't an issue. It was hard to compete with them.
Yeah. Yeah. And the eventual company closure, there's a story with that where I saw a quote of yours where it was basically, you came in a little bit too early with the computer based stuff. Can you give us some insight on that one? Sure,
because that's pretty much what happened, or it was a big factor, put it that way. So, once we started with MIDI, the next thing we did, and this was, I pointed this out in my first talk at the AES show. I said, computers are going to be a part of what MIDI will be involved with, Mm-hmm. They were still, really slow. We were talking Commodore 64s and Apple IIe's. I don't think the PC was even out yet. I don't remember the history dates for sure. So we actually started building interfaces for Commodore 64s and little cartridges for this. We actually dabbled in some really basic software apps to do, sequencing or recording or put notes on a screen or just, really basic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And we started building cards that would fit in computers and even video games. I remember we designed a 6-voice analog voice card for, I forget the name of video company. It was a spin-off of Atari. So we were I was thinking, oh, well, this is where the future is going to be. As computers get bigger and faster, we should get into the computer aspect of music and sound. But, we're still a small, underfunded company, and we kind of took a chance and spent marketing dollars and development time on that when we probably should have stayed in our professional space. So by the time the Prophet 2000 and the Prophet VS, the Prophet 3000, the Studio 440 came out, it was a little too late to the game. We kind of lost 2 or 3 years there. So that was really the problem. It was way too early to get into the computer market. I think, even Sound Blaster wasn't quite there yet. So
right.
It was, typical case of being, too early to a market being just as bad as being too late to a market.
Too late to the market, yeah.
I'm glad you did it though. My first MIDI interface was a cartridge clicked into the back of my Commodore. So and being able to do recording on that was pretty good.
There you go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. So after the company closed, that so it was purchased by Yamaha in 1987. Can you describe your role at Yamaha? Because you weren't there for very long, were you?
Well, it was a strange situation, and just to keep the story short, basically they bought the company, out of bankruptcy, and then they couldn't really decide what to do with it because Yamaha in LA, the United States, wanted to do one thing or didn't want to be involved, and Yamaha in Japan didn't want to get involved. And so, we were working on some product and some technology, and they just decided after a year to close it because, they couldn't figure that out. So, that's the short story, which is fine. It all worked out.
Right. And so from that point, then you yourself and your team moved to Korg. And this is where the Wave Station was actually developed. Now, this is one of my favorite all-time synths, Dave. I've got a Wave Station AD proudly in my rack, and I think Pete's got one as well, haven't you, Pete?
Cool.
I've got one of the new ones, but not one of the old ones.
So I've got the AD.
Yeah, you've got the good stuff. Yeah. Well, I mean, they're all good, but you've got the nicer, older one.
I got the Prima. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you give us the backstory on that Wave Station? Because it's an interesting one. So is it a direct development from the VS, or just the ideas were used and then it was expanded, or?
Well, it was a few different things. First of all, when Yamaha closed us, about 2 weeks after that, Korg approached me and said, well, we're thinking of starting something up. Are you interested? And I said, well, sure, but if you want to do it, you need to do it very quickly because everybody's kind of scattering. So to their credit, they did. And I started the Korg R&D group in San Jose in 1989, I think it was. And that group is still active.
Wow.
All this time later.
Yep.
So we had actually started working on one of the products we started working on for Yamaha was the idea of something along the lines of the Wave Station. But the basic concept, I still have memories of talking, with the development team, and I was on a blackboard, whiteboard, and I said, what if we, instead of having, the VS style where it's two-dimensional, what if we just had the 4 oscillators and just kind of unfolded them linearly and have them each kind of be a sequencer per oscillator and do that instead? Sounds like something to be kind of fun to do. So when you hit a note, it triggers 1 to 4 different little mini sequences that plays or loops or whatever. So that was the concept. It was sort of a follow-up in that it had digital oscillators and, 4 of them, and a clever way to, make the music and the sound evolve as you held a note. Because, it didn't obviously have to be a sequence in terms of note stepping. It could just be, any parameter Well, I don't have to tell you how it works.
Yeah.
It was just a new concept, and at the time we were working with new technology. Well, whatever technology that Korg had already, and we were trying to figure out ways of using their existing digital ICs, custom chips that they were using. And so that was the other part of it. Okay, well, this is what they do. How can we use that? And what can we make it do? And the result was the Wave Station.
Yeah, incredible. Now, one interesting point with the Wave Station, and I've only got 2 instruments in my arsenal that do this, that the actual, components of the patch, the partial components of the patch, say you got 4 parts, that they're actually built up. So you've got a component where it's a partial, and then you build the patch from, say, four partials to complete the patch. You can't actually then just save the single patch and then just put it and then share it with someone. You have to share the whole bank. You understand what I'm saying, Dave?
I don't remember any of that.
Yeah.
I haven't played one of these in 30 years. So.
Yeah, so you actually, the only way that you could actually create patch banks is that you have to have a whole bank of patches, which were made up of, smaller component parts of the patch, and then you build the patch up using these smaller components. Very, very difficult to, say, hey, if you had someone else that wanted to share a patch with you, they're going, well, I have to share the whole bank.
Right.
And so that's why, they were coming out with the later Wave Stations with all of the patches built into one, just because they were so difficult to actually be able to program and share patches. The only other instrument that works in that manner is my D70, and but I was used to it. I was managing that if I needed to make a custom patch, that I needed to remember that if I needed to save that and use it on another instrument or another Wave Station, I'd have to save the whole bank. You just couldn't save the patch.
I thought you were going to ask for tech support there for a second, Vin. I didn't know where.
No. There was just like an anomaly on those instruments, and they both. I think they both came out around that 1990, and it's interesting. So one was a Roland, and one was a Korg, and both had that same type of patch structure. Which I found interesting, and I own both of them. So, that's just something that I navigated back in the day. All right. Well, after the Wave Station, you left Korg, and so the 90s, that was an interesting era for you, Dave, because you weren't doing hardware.
No. Yeah, it was... As you know, I got involved with Sear Systems in the mid-90s, where we did I think we did 3 generations of soft synths. We did the first one we did under contract to Intel, and it was a very basic one that ran on a 486. Somehow we managed to get that to work.
Yep, miracle.
And then the second generation was for a Pentium, where things got reasonable because we finally had floating point. And we did that. We did a product for Creative Labs.
Yes.
And they made something called the AWE 64.
Yes.
It was 32 voices of hardware synthesis and another 32 voices of software synthesis that we made for them.
Yes.
And then after that, we did the third version, which what we called Reality, which was supposed to be a professional level software synth. And it actually had subtractive synthesis and FM and sampling and some physical modeling. So, it was a pretty complete product. And I think that came out in maybe 96. So that was, again, the first soft synth really for professionals.
Yes, of course.
Well, I had no idea that was you.
Yep.
That is a nice bit of connecting the dots there.
Yeah. So you were essentially the first soft synth. I was chatting to Ernst from Propeller Heads, and we were kind of weighing up whether they were one of the first. So you actually beat them to the punch.
I think we beat them and also Native Instruments, because I actually remember Stefan Schmidt coming by our booth, I think at NAMM, looking at what we were doing, or maybe it was CES or something before, he was obviously the person who started Native. So yeah, I don't like claiming to be first when I can't be absolutely sure, but I'm pretty sure that Reality was the first pro soft synth, and we had it at NAMM. People were coming up and saying, "Hey, what's that? It sounds good." And we say, "Oh, it's a software synth." And they go, "What do you mean?" "Oh, it's a synth, but it's all done in software." Where is it? It's software right in the computer. What do you mean? So it was a concept that very few people understood initially.
Yeah. And how quickly that changed, very rapidly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, we were unfortunately correct when we said that it was the future of music synthesis.
Yeah.
But anyhow.
Yeah. So, hey, let's fast forward into the noughties, and you're back onto hardware.
Around 2000, I'd say. What happened is I was helping Roger Lynn with a product he had called the Adrenaline.
Yes.
He was just finishing it up, so I did, I forget, a little hardware, a little software design on it. And I just realized how much more fun it was to work on a piece of hardware where it's your OS. You don't have to update it for anybody else. You're in 100% control of the product. Whatever a knob does will do the same thing in 20 years. It's not going to change. You don't have to update it. So that convinced me that, software was stupid. And I apologies to anybody who might happen to work for Microsoft. But for musical instruments, for me, it just didn't make sense. So I started working on what was going to become the Evolver, and I started shipping that 20 years ago this year.
Yeah, amazing.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah,
thank you.
I do remember that little box I had the hands on because I was involved with the local distributor here in Australia, and I remember holding it and going, "Sorry, Dave, where's the knobs?" That was my first time. I go, "Where are the knobs?" But they came later, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, it had been 15 or more years since I had done hardware. So I was, relearning how to do things. Fortunately, the tools got a whole lot better during that time.
Yep.
So it's a lot easier for one person to do all this because for the first 5 years, Dave Smith Instruments was just me. I didn't have anybody working for me. So I did everything as efficiently as possible. So it was, something I couldn't have done, obviously, 20 years before that. So it was fun. It was so much more fun to get back into hardware. I mean, it's and ever since.
Yeah. So I mean, under the Dave Smith Instruments banner, there was the Polyevolver from memory.
Yep.
Dave, did you do all the graphic design, the visual style of things like the Polyevolver and stuff yourself as well, or?
Mostly, I certainly did all the design. I think, I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head. There was somebody who helped me with the actual layout, just doing the Polyphonic Illustrator, just helping me lay it all out. I mean, I obviously did all the mechanical design and circuit boards, but I think that one had an overlay, so it was helpful to have somebody who could do that.
Right. I was just thinking back. The Polyevolver was a gorgeous instrument, so I was curious who gets credit for that. Yeah. Sounds like it's you. So awesome.
Yeah. And the return of the Prophet in 2008 with the Prophet 08, Dave. I thought that was awesome. Now we're gonna have to fast forward 7 years. Let's jump to 2015 because that was a pretty pivotal point. And that was the return of the Sequential Circuits brand name to you. And from my understanding, Taro was involved in giving the guys some encouragement to give you your name back.
Yeah, I mean, I think the story's already out there that
Yes.
we both got our Grammys together in 2013.
Well, that's right. Okay, so let's roll back to that. Sorry. So 2013, yourself and Taro both got music tech Grammys. Is that what it was?
Yeah, technical Grammys for MIDI.
For MIDI, yes, of course. Awesome.
Yeah, so that was pretty cool. And so I didn't know he was doing this, but I guess it was that year. He sent a letter to the president of Yamaha and just kind of said, hey, I think you should give Dave the rights to the names back.
Right.
And of course, they hadn't done anything with them in
No.
30 years or whatever.
Of course.
So I just got a call or saw somebody at a trade show, or I forget the first contact with somebody from Yamaha, and they said, well, hey, do you want your names back? And I thought about it. Well, it's nothing that I had asked for. It's nothing I was thinking about. It was nothing I needed. And so I just said, well, sure. Okay, why not? Yeah. And so we started going through the process, and they said, well, we need to charge you something for it. I said, that's fine. So, he threw out a number, and I said, sure, that sounds fine. He said, oh, well, it can be less. And I said, oh, okay. So I said half the amount, and he said, well, is that okay? And at that point I said, yeah, because I had to pay something, it was only fair because this is a huge thing. So yeah, that's when we got the rights back. I think that was 2014, maybe that happened. And at first, we didn't do anything with it. It was still Dave Smith Instruments. But we were working on this new product in 2014 that would become the Prophet 6.
Yes.
Which shipped in 2015. And we just all kind of looked at each other and said, well, just for fun, let's make that a sequential product.
Yeah.
So we did, and it came out in 2015. It's hard to believe it's already been out for 7 years. But it was still a Dave Smith Instruments product. So it wasn't until 2018 that we finally just said, you know what, we should just change the company name. And that's when it was official. So it's only really been official for about 4 years.
Yeah. So that was 2018, and that's the 40th anniversary of the Prophet 5.
Yes, it was.
Wow.
And we're approaching the 50th anniversary of Sequential Circuits. That'll be in 2 years.
Yeah, 2 years. So that's amazing, Dave. So look, we've almost come full circle because you guys have re-released the Prophet 5 and 10, except the Prophet 10 is not this, huge behemoth anymore. It's actually just a really sleek looking Prophet 5 looking thing, but with 10 voices. And there's a whole stack of new instruments that you guys, you're not exactly, sitting on your haunches there. I mean, there's a stack of new instruments that have been coming out. Now, one that was really interesting for me was the OB6, because that was in collaboration with Tom Oberheim. Can you give us a little bit of insight on that OB6?
Sure. It has to do with the design of the Prophet 6. I don't know if you've ever looked inside one, but you almost think of it as a motherboard, and there's 6 card slots, and each of the cards in those slots is basically a monophonic, completely programmable synthesizer.
Right.
So you put 6 Prophet 6 cards in there, and you have a Prophet 6. So after we did that, we realized, obviously, I'm sure we thought about it before that, well, if we just change the voice card to something else and then change the front panel, we could have a completely different instrument.
Right.
And so the obvious thing to do was to put an SCM filter in there, multi-state variable. And so we changed the cards, redesigned the front panel, which is easy stuff. And all of a sudden we had the OB6, and it was a very quick development project. And it's a completely different product. It's a completely different sound. As you know, I was a little concerned when we were working on it, because I said, well, what if this just sounds like another polyphonic synth? I don't know. I hope this is a good idea. But as soon as we got sound out of it, the first time we played it, we all kind of looked at each other and goes, well, yep, this is an Oberheim. It's not the same. Completely different.
I love that design. What stunned me about seeing that is, if you look back at some of the old Oberheim synths, they also used a kind of a voice card approach. I forget if there's 1 or 2 voices on a card, but they're like 10 times the size of what you have inside the OB6 and the Prophet 6. And so when I saw one of those voice cards, I was stunned on how much you managed to fit on that little card.
Well, that's the great thing about modern technology is that everything is tiny. You could put stuff on both sides of the board. You could build them fairly inexpensively, and of course, everything works better when it's surface mount, and it's more reliable. I mean, everything about it is just so much better than the monstrosities we dealt with in the old days.
And it doesn't heat your room when you're playing. So
that too.
And it doesn't go out of tune.
Yeah.
Well, they will drift, not as much. And of course, we have very high-speed DSPs and processors keeping track of things. So they only go to tune when you want them to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that gives it a bit of character, Dave. Let's be honest. You know, those old analog synths having to retune in the middle of a gig. Yeah.
Well, exactly. And along those lines, that's why we came up with the vintage knob on the Prophet 5 is, this downside of stuff now is that it's too good. Yeah. Even though it's all analog, it's basically the same as a Prophet 5. It's just digitally controlled analog, but the digital control is so much better. And instead of having 40 or 50 or 60 little trimmers inside that have to be adjusted perfectly, we have 0.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But sometimes you want, that is, like you just said, the beauty of the old instruments is their sloppiness and, the difference in voice to voice and unit to unit. So we came up with a clever way of having a knob that does just that. So if you have it off, it's a nice, tight, modern sound. If you want just a little bit of slop, you just turn it up a little. And if you really want it loose, you keep turning it up. And it's kind of amazing how well that works.
Yeah.
Just because I know some folks might misinterpret what you just said, it's not the same thing as a DCO. You're controlling a DAC that's delivering the voltage to the oscillators at that point, as opposed to running off a timing circuit or something. So it's like the old Jupiter 8 technology, but it's just come a long way since then.
Well, it's the Prophet 5 technology.
The Prophet 5 technology.
Yeah, it was the first product that had automatic oscillator tuning. So it's just so much better. But, even the DCO thing, DCO's got a bad rap originally because people didn't quite understand that a DCO is an analog oscillator. Right. The only difference is that the timing comes from a processor, but you could do the same thing there. And we did. We've, a number of our products have DCOs in them now. And if you control them fast enough, it's really, you get the benefits of both worlds. It's really pretty cool.
Yeah.
It is still funny to think that the reason why everybody went digital originally was the slop and retuning and everything. And now we're kind of back around to having to add that back in.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and people used to complain, the very first Prophet 5s, they'd bring them in to be serviced. And one of the things we do is adjust all those trimmers to get things tight again. And then they'd claim that we did something to make them sound not as good. When all we did is actually make them more accurate.
Right.
So everybody knows this about musical instruments. I mean, it's not new news that it's the imperfections in musical instruments that make them interesting and makes them sound good. So there's always a balance there. And that's why, digital synths sounded like shit for a long time. Or if they didn't sound like, they had their own sound. They
had their own character.
They had their own character, which is good. For a lot of things you want to do, that's a good thing. But they're just a little too rigid. And of course, they've gotten better. Obviously a soft synth is a digital synth, and they've gotten better at, doing the kind of things we're doing. But, and we use digital oscillators sometimes in a lot of our products. The one thing we always have, though, is analog filters, because I still think that's where the magic is. Of course. Most of the time. So.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. I've been following some recent discussion on an instrument that we're going to get to in a minute, and just watching the differing opinions of, especially from the purists, and I'm like, man, no matter what you do, Dave, no matter what you do, you're never going to please everyone. All right. And some of the stuff that I've been reading, I've gone, guys, get back in your cave, right? And we will cover this when we get to this next instrument, because this is a really interesting one, really exciting one. But just before we get to that, just real quickly, Sequential is now part of the Focusrite family.
Yes.
Now, when did that happen? Was that 2021? Am I correct in that?
It was just over a year ago. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So you guys are part of the Focusrite family. You're still involved with the company and the product design?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
In product development only now. I'm not doing any running the company stuff anymore.
Right. Okay. So we got the Focusrite banner, which is interesting because they've also got Novation. So is there any cross-pollination going on there, or just completely different teams?
Well, generally, we both have our own product lines with different directions. Obviously in the long term, there'll be probably more cross-pollination, but and beyond that, I can't say a whole lot.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
It is interesting having two synth companies under the same umbrella.
Yeah.
And I think that can only be good for the long term.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
But yeah, obviously so far, everything we've come out with has been our products, and the same for them. They're still doing their products. So
yeah, awesome. Now, talking about cross-pollination, you know where I'm going now, don't you?
Who knows?
I'm going to the AAVIM OBX8. Now, that's a pretty exciting synth, and seeing that Tom's got his name back as well, and there was all these little teaser videos, and I'm watching the teaser video, and I recognised you were in there, and Tom was in there, and Marcus Royal was in there, and I can't remember the name of the fourth fella. I think he was an Oberheim tech as well.
That was Tony Karavitas, who's been my main hardware designer for the last 10 years.
Oh, okay.
But he also worked at Oberheim in the old days for a little bit.
Okay, well, there you go. So there's the history, and there's the full circle. So there was that teaser video, and myself and Peter going, hey, what's going on here? And I've gone, what? Tom Oberheim's back. And then Pete actually linked me to the video. I've gone, hang on, Dave's in there. Hang on, Marcus is in there. I'm like, okay, so I'm going to ask the question. Oh boy! I'm going to ask the question, Dave. So can you give us some insight on how that product came about? Because that's really an exciting, and the sound of it, just even on those demos, I'm like, oh god. It's back. It's back,
It has that sound.
Yeah.
Well, obviously there's two things. One, we just got done doing the Prophet 5 redo. So that was an interesting project, and we learned a lot from that. And as you know, we previously worked together when we did the OB6, which was a good partner to the Prophet 6. And just like you said, that sound, people gravitate, when we'd have a lot of artists come in and they'd play the Prophet 6 and then they'd play the OB6 and they'd go back and forth. And some people pick one and some people pick the other.
Of course, yeah.
Fortunately, a lot of people eventually get both because it's just like having a Telecaster and a Les Paul, there's two different guitars and you want them both.
100%.
So, with all that history, it seemed like an obvious thing to do, to consider something like what became the OBX8. So, that was kind of the start of it.
Yeah. And so who was responsible for that, the majority of that development? Was that Tom and Marcus, or was it a team effort? Or
Well, it was a team effort, obviously, yeah. But, clearly we did, most of the nitty-gritty design at Sequential. But yeah, we couldn't have done it without everybody who was involved. So, I'm a pretty good synth designer, but there's no way I could have done that properly by myself, because I just didn't know how it worked. So, definitely having Marcus involved was huge because, he has one each of all the old stuff and knew how they worked and was involved in a lot of them. So, it was a very fun project overall.
Yeah.
Fantastic product.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sounds amazing.
Yeah, because we, I sometimes I have bad dreams about how deep we got into the design, making sure it was absolutely perfect rendition of not one but all three. Of those
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I was about to bring that point up. OBX, OBXA, OB8, and you have different modes that you can switch between them, and then you got all the factory presets. It's like, what?
Yeah. And you could overlap them. You could have one part of an OBX with another part from the OB8 and take different. Yeah. So, but we had to make sure that all three of them were exact and perfect. Right. And so we'd spend lots and lots of time, making sure and listening to them side by side and tweaking things to make sure it was perfect. So
yeah, amazing. Yeah. And my understanding is that those factory presets, you pull them off the old cassette tapes.
We pulled them from old WAV files from old cassette tapes.
Oh yeah,
you'll be able to. I doubt that many people still have cassettes, but if you have them, they'll load. So
I've still got my old Jupiter 8. I don't have my Jupiter 8, but I have my Jupiter 8 cassettes. I found them a couple of years ago. Man, what am I going to do with these things?
Well, plus you need a cassette player.
Oh, I've got one of those. But
there you go. But most people, if they have the old stuff, they have them on a WAV file somewhere. Right. So that's obviously much easier than to try to get a functional cassette that works well enough.
Right. Yeah. So look, I had no idea what that old protocol with the cassette dump, what that actually was storing.
Well, we did that on the Prophet 5 also. It's pretty simple technology. You just have a couple tones for ones and zeros, and with a header and a footer and checksums and all the usual stuff that you would imagine. So it's pretty simple stuff, but that's all we had at the time. If you wanted some way, because this is pre-computer, which is always hard to imagine for people now. But
well, I mean, it used to be funny if we accidentally put one of those patch tapes into the cassette player. And it
sounds like a modem that used to, and we had dial-up. Remember that?
Exactly.
Because it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Finn, that was a beautiful impression.
Yeah, I'm told I'm actually very good at impressions. That's being sarcastic. Hey, just one last thing, Dave, because we're kind of getting there, and I know that you're on a bit of a tight schedule today. If I may ask you your thoughts on the current landscape with music technology in general. This is a question that I ask all of my guests.
Okay. Well, I've never been what I would call a futurist. I think it's kind of silly to predict what's going to happen a few years from now, even a year from now. I mean, I kind of saw the home computer thing coming, but that was obvious, and a few other things. But the cool thing is, relative to what we were talking about earlier about why people wanted emulative instruments. And, that's kind of why analog synths disappeared for 10 years during what I call the digital dark ages of the 90s.
Yes.
Yep.
And in the 20 years since, it's taken some time, but this time around, everybody's playing analog synths because they want to play an analog synth.
Yep.
Everybody's already got 20 versions of a sampler playback engine, so there's less and less reason to buy the newest one to get the latest piano and the more voices and more bits or whatever. But with analog synthesis, it's past the test of time. Everybody knows how it works. I think it's going to continue. I think it's here to stay. Everybody knows what to expect when you turn a cutoff knob or an envelope knob or a resonance knob because it's universal.
Yep.
It doesn't matter if it's on an analog synth or a digital synth or software. It's the concept is it's understood universally. So we're not done. There are still so many analog synth versions we can come up with that haven't been done. As you probably know, I always try to make designs that have their own personality and sound and that are different from others. I mean, obviously, if you look at them, it's a whole bunch of knobs and a keyboard. How different can they be? But that's the that's where the art is of the design, is to come up with something that people go, oh, this is different, has different sound, gives me different ideas, the inspiration's different. That's kind of what it's all about for designing musical instruments.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed some of your hybrid instruments, like the Pro 2 and the Pro 3. That's just such an interesting combination.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, we didn't talk about the purist thing, fortunately, because I probably sound like an old man when I laugh at all of that. But it's, the Prophet 12 Pro 2 is really cool, having digital oscillators in the Prophet 12. You could do linear FM with them, but you run it through an analog filter, and then they have, delay per voice. And, so, even the original Volver, the whole concept was to combine analog and digital in a unique way to come up with something new. So I try not to take sides. It's not like analog is the best and digital sucks. It's You have to be more specific than that. And it's especially funny when anybody, I don't care if you have 100% analog, modular, synth, or whatever, if anybody listens to it, you're listening to it digitally. So, because it's posted somewhere, you can't listen unless you're streaming. Sure, you could put it on an LP, but let's face it, everybody listens to things digital. So,
or Vin's cassette player, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, I haven't broken that out for any listening. But look, just on that point, I think it has come full circle. So it's not only the analog synthesizers. And I'm trying to remember, one of the other guests was saying, he goes, I don't understand. Everyone's gone back to modular synthesizers, as in like non-program, modules and patch chords. I've gone, well, it's more hands-on, it's more organic, and that's essentially what has been driving it. I think people not only want the sound, but they also want to have that hands-on, and they want to grab a knob or a fader and go, okay, this is what it does.
Yeah, and it's fun. It's a good way to really learn what you're doing. A lot of people who play our programmable synths probably never ever know exactly how all of it works, but it's easy to use. But the analog, the modular stuff, I don't like the idea that you can't press a button and save the sound. And it could be a huge time sink. I do know a number of artists that finally just got rid of their modular systems because they just didn't have the time. You can't spend that much time on something. It's great fun, though. I think a lot of people get caught up in collector-itis, where, I can buy one more module next week, and that's going to be really cool. And which is fun. I mean, I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I think it's great to get this many people playing them, understanding them. And I'm surprised that it's still going strong. I mean, I wouldn't have predicted that. I mean, speaking of being unable to predict the future, I never would have seen this happening and happening still. I mean, it's cool.
Look,
very
cool. And I think it is very, very cool that we'll call them the kids, because we're all kind of age. We're all got a few years on us, but the younger generation getting back into actually understanding the signal flow. So you've got an oscillator, it's running through a filter. Then you've got your modulation capabilities with your LFOs. Then what your actual envelopes are doing. Now, being able to get in there and understand all that. Now, we didn't have a choice, Dave, right? We didn't have a choice. My first synth was a Korg Monopoly. Now, let me tell you, that could make a blip blop, and unless I got dug in there and actually understood what I was doing with it, that thing wasn't going to make a peep, And that was very much the whole landscape pre the Prophet 5. You needed to understand what was going on with the synthesizers, with every knob on that synth. And also, if you wanted to go performing live and you needed more than one sound, you needed more than one synthesizer. So that's why you saw the kind of Rick Wakeman-esque, multi-keyboard stands in there, got their arms flayed out one side or the other, and, playing multiple sounds on multiple keyboards, because it was, that's the only way you could get multiple sounds live. So that was awesome, and I still remember those days very, very fondly. And everything that I learnt on programming that first preset machine has served me for 40 years. So it's actually good that the younger generation are actually going back to that. I mean, they still can fall back on the presets, obviously, right? But for them to actually grab a knob and understand what it's doing to the sound, I think that's invaluable. And I think it's great that, and I do hope that the whole analog revival continues. And and it's the same with like vinyl. I've had a few friends say to me, mate, you still got all your vinyl? I said, every single one that I've had since I was a kid, I've got it here. It's in the studio. It's right next to my 15-year-old son and says, what are these? I said, these are LPs. And he says, can we play them? I said, I don't have a working turntable, but I'm gonna get one. And there's a few friends that have gone out and bought some really nice turntables and stuff, and so I'm going to venture back because I still remember the sound difference between that and a CD, let alone an MP3, is just astonishing. And I want to actually get the kids to actually experience that original vinyl sound, that analog organic sound. So that's where I'm going to be heading back. Now, Dave, I think let's put a pin in it. And Dave, you're more than welcome to come back at any time. That has been an awesome show for me. Thank you again to both you and Pete for your time and energy today. That has been fantastic. And okay.
It's been fun.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah.
Memory lane and all that.
Oh, mate, it's been fantastic. All right. That's another one off the bucket list. And with that, on to the next.